The city that was never meant to fall. Why did Babylon really fall? Not the version carved into victory inscriptions, not the simple tale of an army marching in, but the deeper truth, the quiet collapse that began long before the gates were opened and the soldiers stepped through the riverbed. Babylon was not supposed to fall. To the people who lived within its colossal walls, the idea was almost absurd. The city was not just large, it was overwhelming, engineered to intimidate both enemies and imagination. Its double walls stretched for miles, thick enough for chariots to ride across the top. Its gates were plated with bronze. Its towers caught the desert wind and turned it into a low, constant hum, as if the city itself were breathing. Beyond the defenses rose temples layered in glazed blue bricks, gardens terraced high above the streets, and palaces whose halls reflected torchlight like rippling gold. Babylon did not look like a place that could be conquered. It looked eternal. The Euphrates River ran straight through the heart of the city, controlled by massive gates and embankments. It brought water, trade, life, and, people believed, protection. The river was thought to be a gift from the gods, a natural shield that split the city and made surprise nearly impossible. To an outsider, Babylon seemed like the center of the world. To its citizens, it was the center of order itself. Here stood the ziggurat of Marduk, rising in steps toward the heavens. Here priests read the stars and declared the will of the gods. Here laws were recorded, trade flourished, and caravans arrived from lands most Babylonians would never see. If the gods favored any city, surely it was this one. Generations had grown up under the belief that Babylon's power was unshakable. The Assyrians had fallen, the Egyptians had weakened, kingdoms rose and vanished beyond the horizon, but Babylon endured. Every brick seemed to say the same thing: we have always been here, and we always will. That belief shaped how people lived. Merchants invested in long ventures, confident in the stability of their markets. Families built homes meant to last generations. Officials debated politics inside marble courtyards without urgency, certain that tomorrow would look like yesterday. Confidence became culture. But permanence is dangerous when it turns into complacency. The walls that impressed visitors also hid problems from view. The wealth that filled the treasuries did not reach everyone. Farmers along the canals struggled under taxes that funded monuments and feasts in the capital. Priests argued quietly over influence, each temple guarding its own power. The king himself was distant, more devoted to grand religious projects and personal interests than to the daily concerns of his people. None of this seemed like the beginning of an ending. It felt like normal life in a great city, complex, imperfect, but secure. Beyond Babylon's horizon, however, the world was changing. A new power was rising in the east, led by a ruler whose ambition did not stop at borders. His name was Cyrus, and while Babylon feasted, built, and believed in its own eternity, he was studying it. He did not see an invincible city. He saw a giant that had grown comfortable, heavy with pride, slow to react. He understood something Babylon had forgotten. Walls defend a city only as long as the people inside believe in what they are defending. Babylon's fall did not begin with a battle cry or the clash of swords. It began with an idea, the idea that the city could never fall. And once a civilization believes that, it stops preparing for the day it might. The night of the feast. On the night Babylon fell, its king was throwing a feast, and the sound of music echoed through halls built to celebrate eternity rather than prepare for danger. Lamps burned bright along palace corridors, casting warm light over carved lions and winged bulls that had guarded the empire's pride for generations. Wine flowed freely, poured into cups shaped like sacred vessels, and laughter rolled across the courtyards where nobles reclined on embroidered cushions, convinced that history itself would bend to Babylon's permanence. Outside those walls, the city followed the rhythm of celebration, unaware that the silence beyond the horizon was not peace, but the quiet patience of an approaching fate. Inside the banquet hall, musicians played harps and flutes, their melodies softening the air heavy with incense and roasted meats. The king, surrounded by advisors and guests, lifted golden cups taken long ago from conquered temples, symbols of Babylon's triumph over rival kingdoms. To drink from them was to remind everyone in the room of the city's power, its divine favor, and its supposed invincibility. Yet beneath the noise of the feast, an unease lingered like a shadow no one dared name. Messengers had come and gone in recent weeks, bringing news of Persian movements, of armies gathering beyond the desert, of towns surrendering without resistance. But the walls were high, the gates were strong, and the Euphrates flowed like a natural barrier through the city's heart. No one in that hall believed an enemy could truly breach Babylon. The mood was not fear, but defiance disguised as celebration. Servants moved swiftly through the crowd, refilling goblets, adjusting lamps, keeping the illusion of control alive. Nobles spoke loudly of past victories, of Assyria's fall and Egypt's retreat, as if history were a shield that would forever deflect danger. Priests present at the feast assured the king that the gods had not abandoned Babylon, that omens could be interpreted favorably, that rituals performed in the temples would keep disaster at bay. Their words floated easily in a room eager to believe them. No one wanted to be the voice that disrupted the music, that suggested walls could fail or rivers could be turned against them. Meanwhile, far from the sound of flutes and laughter, Persian engineers worked in the darkness. They moved quietly along the riverbanks, digging channels, redirecting the Euphrates with a patience that did not require celebration. Their torches were shielded, their orders whispered. Where Babylon's night blazed with light and noise, the Persians embraced shadow and silence. The contrast could not have been sharper. One side convinced the story was already written, the other determined to rewrite it before dawn. Back inside the palace, the feast grew louder. Cups clinked, dancers spun, and the king, surrounded by loyal voices, felt the comforting weight of tradition. He believed the city's history guaranteed its future. But history does not protect those who stop paying attention to the present. As the river's level began to drop, almost imperceptibly at first, Babylon's greatest defense was quietly becoming its greatest vulnerability. Yet in the palace, no one noticed. The night was too bright, the music too loud, the confidence too deep. Babylon was celebrating its eternity on the very evening that eternity slipped silently through its fingers. A river that changed history. Long before armies gathered and kings made their fatal decisions, the Euphrates had already shaped Babylon's destiny. The Euphrates was more than a waterway. It was the city's lifeline, its shield, its artery of trade and survival. It cut through the heart of Babylon, flowing between walls of baked brick and stone embankments that had been engineered with astonishing precision. Massive gates controlled its flow where it entered and exited the city, allowing Babylon's rulers to command the water as if they commanded nature itself. For generations, this mastery of the river had been a source of pride and security. The Euphrates nourished the fields beyond the walls, filled canals that carried water to distant farmland, and allowed boats to glide directly into the city's markets. Grain, timber, metals, and spices all passed along its current. The river made Babylon rich, and that wealth, in turn, funded the towering walls and grand temples that reinforced the belief that the city could never be overcome. But the same river that gave life also carried a quiet risk, one that few inside the city truly feared. Water can be guided, but it cannot be owned forever. Its course can be shaped, but it still obeys gravity, terrain, and time. Babylon's engineers had bent the Euphrates to their will, yet they had also grown dependent on its predictable behavior. The river's presence inside the walls felt like a permanent feature of the landscape, as natural and unchangeable as the sky. This sense of stability dulled imagination. To most Babylonians, the idea that the Euphrates itself could become a pathway for an invading army seemed impossible. Who would dare challenge a force that flowed with divine blessing through the center of the world's greatest city? Who would think to turn a God-given defense into a weapon? But outside the walls, Persian commanders were studying the river with different eyes. They did not see a sacred boundary. They saw a system of gates, embankments, and channels that could be altered with enough labor and patience. Where Babylonians saw permanence, the Persians saw opportunity. They understood that water follows the path offered to it, and if that path could be widened or redirected, even the mightiest city could be made vulnerable. The plan that began to take shape did not rely on brute force. Babylon's walls were too thick, its defenders too confident behind their fortifications. A direct assault would be costly and uncertain. Instead, the Persians focused on the river's natural flow beyond the city. By digging channels and basins upstream, they could slowly divert the Euphrates' water into newly carved pathways. It was a strategy that required time and secrecy, not dramatic battles. It depended on Babylon's complacency, on the assumption that no one would attempt something so audacious. Inside the city, daily life continued as it always had. Boats still drifted along the river, merchants still unloaded cargo, children still played near the embankments. The water level dropped only gradually, almost too subtly to alarm anyone at first. Seasonal variations in the river were normal, and small changes did not immediately signal danger. Guards at the river gates noticed the shift, but without clear orders or a sense of urgency, they treated it as a curiosity rather than a threat. The Euphrates had always been a friend. It was difficult to imagine it becoming the road that led enemies into the heart of Babylon. Yet history turns on what people fail to imagine. The river that had carried Babylon to greatness was quietly preparing to carry its conquerors inside. The city that trusted its natural defenses more than its own vigilance was about to learn that the most powerful structures can be undone not by strength, but by understanding where they are weakest. The prophecy everyone ignored.
Long before Persian soldiers ever touched the riverbed, whispers had moved through Babylon like a faint wind that stirred the edges of daily life but never quite reached the center of power. Babylon was a city that listened to signs. Priests read the stars, studied the flight of birds, watched the behavior of sacrificial animals, and recorded dreams as if they were messages from another realm. The belief that the gods spoke through omens was woven into the city's identity. And yet, when the warnings came, they were treated not as alarms but as inconveniences, softened by interpretation and pushed aside by confidence. Strange patterns appeared in the sky during those months. Astronomers noted irregular movements among the planets, subtle shifts that in earlier generations might have caused immediate rituals of appeasement. But now, interpretations were debated rather than feared. Some priests insisted the signs foretold victory, others urged caution, yet their voices were diluted by the political atmosphere of reassurance. The king preferred hopeful readings, and in a court where favor meant survival, few were eager to insist on darker conclusions. The machinery of belief began to serve comfort instead of truth. Dreams, too, circulated among the people. Tales spread of visions in which walls crumbled or rivers ran dry. In markets and quiet homes, these stories stirred unease, but in the palace they were dismissed as the anxiety of commoners. The ruling class had grown used to hearing rumors of danger that never arrived. Each false alarm strengthened the conviction that Babylon was protected by destiny. When fear fails to materialize often enough, people stop responding to it altogether. Even the temples showed subtle signs of strain. Offerings decreased in some districts, not from lack of devotion, but from economic pressure. Priests argued quietly about resource distribution, their disagreements hidden behind ritual formality. The unity that had once made Babylon's spiritual life a source of strength was weakening, replaced by cautious rivalry. Yet these tensions remained beneath the surface, masked by ceremonies that continued to project an image of harmony. To an outside observer, the temples still stood magnificent, their rituals precise, their chants rising toward the heavens. Inside, however, the certainty that the gods would always defend Babylon had begun to waver. Beyond the walls, Persian intelligence gathered fragments of this atmosphere. Traders, travelers, and defectors carried stories of political disputes, of dissatisfaction with leadership, of priests who questioned royal priorities. Cyrus and his advisors understood that morale can be as important as military strength. A city that doubts its own divine protection is easier to take than one united by faith. The prophecies, dismissed within Babylon, became pieces of a psychological landscape the Persians quietly studied. On the night of the feast, when strange lights were said to flicker above the temples and animals in the streets behaved restlessly, many citizens felt a tremor of unease they could not explain. But the music from the palace drowned out those feelings. Celebration was louder than caution. The belief in Babylon's eternity had become stronger than any sign that challenged it. Prophecy, once a guide, had become background noise. And so the city walked toward its fate, not because it had no warnings, but because it had learned to reinterpret them until they no longer demanded action. The fall of Babylon was not just a failure of walls or armies. It was a failure to listen when the future whispered instead of shouted. The rise of Persia. While Babylon drifted deeper into comfort and ritual, A different kind of power was taking shape beyond the eastern mountains. A power built not on ancient monuments or inherited prestige, but on motion, ambition, and a ruler who understood that the world was changing. The Persians were not yet the stuff of legend in Babylonian minds. To many in the great city, they were simply another distant people, one more name among the many tribes and kingdoms that rose and fell at the edges of empire. But under Cyrus, Persia was becoming something new, a force that did not rely solely on fear, but on strategy, alliances, and a careful reading of its enemies' weaknesses. Cyrus was not like the kings Babylon was used to defeating. He did not march blindly into fortified cities expecting walls to collapse from intimidation alone. He watched, listened, and learned. His earlier campaigns had shown a pattern. Instead of destroying every conquered land, he often allowed local customs and religions to continue, presenting himself not as a destroyer, but as a liberator. This reputation traveled ahead of his armies. In regions dissatisfied with their rulers, the name of Cyrus began to sound less like a threat and more like a possibility. By the time Persian forces turned their attention toward Babylon, Cyrus had already defeated powerful kingdoms and expanded his influence across vast territories. Each victory added soldiers to his ranks and confidence to his commanders. More importantly, it gave him experience in dealing with large, complex states. He understood that empires rarely fall from a single blow. They unravel where loyalty has weakened and leadership has grown distant. Babylon, for all its splendor, fit that pattern more than its citizens realized. Persian envoys and spies gathered information long before the first soldier approached the Euphrates. They learned about the political tensions inside Babylon, about the king's absence from daily governance, about the dissatisfaction among certain priestly and noble factions. They noted how trade networks could be disrupted, how border regions reacted slowly to central commands, how the once feared Babylonian army had grown cautious and less decisive. To Cyrus, these were not random details, they were openings. He did not need Babylon to be weak everywhere. He only needed it to be weak in the right places at the right time. The contrast between the two powers could not have been sharper. Babylon looked backward for strength, drawing confidence from its ancient achievements, its towering walls, its sacred traditions. Persia looked forward, shaped by recent victories and the flexibility to adapt. Where Babylon trusted in what had always worked, Persia searched for what might work now. This difference in mindset would prove more decisive than numbers or weapons. As Persian forces advanced westward, they did so with discipline and patience. They secured alliances with neighboring regions, isolated Babylon diplomatically, and positioned their armies with care. There was no rush to crash against the city's defenses. Cyrus understood that time itself could be a weapon, especially against a rival that believed it had endless supplies and unshakable security. The rise of Persia was not a sudden storm on Babylon's horizon. It was a tide that had been coming for years, unnoticed by those who believed their shoreline could never be reached. By the time Babylon truly looked outward and recognized the scale of the threat, Persia was no longer a distant power. It was a presence at the gates of history, ready to step into the space Babylon had slowly vacated through complacency and division. A kingdom rotten from inside. From the outside, Babylon still looked like the greatest city on earth, its walls rising like a man-made mountain range, its temples gleaming under the sun, its markets overflowing with goods from distant lands. But inside those walls, something less visible had begun to decay, not in a single dramatic collapse, but in the slow weakening of trust between rulers and ruled. Empires do not usually fall when their enemies are strongest. They fall when their own foundations have grown brittle. In Babylon, wealth still flowed, but it no longer flowed evenly. Grand building projects continued, monuments rose, and courtly ceremonies grew ever more elaborate. Yet many farmers along the canals felt the pressure of heavier taxes and stricter demands. The irrigation system that had once symbolized cooperation between state and countryside now felt like a chain binding labor to the needs of the capital. When harvests were poor, relief was slow and often insufficient. Resentment did not erupt into open rebellion, but it settled quietly into daily conversations, into the way people spoke about distant authorities with less pride and more weariness. Among the elite, divisions deepened as well. Noble families competed for influence at court, forming factions that whispered against one another behind decorated walls. Positions were granted not always for competence, but for loyalty to particular individuals. This weakened the efficiency of administration. Decisions took longer, messages were delayed, and policies shifted depending on which faction had gained temporary favor. To those outside the palace, the state began to feel less like a steady force and more like a shifting set of personalities whose priorities were unclear. Corruption, once limited and discreet, became more visible. Officials responsible for collecting taxes or overseeing trade sometimes used their roles for personal gain. Merchants complained quietly of bribes required to move goods smoothly through checkpoints. Legal disputes could be influenced by gifts rather than by strict adherence to law. None of these practices alone would have destroyed Babylon, but together they eroded confidence in the fairness of the system. When people begin to believe that power serves itself before it serves the state, their willingness to sacrifice for that state weakens. Even the military felt the effects. Babylon still maintained forces capable of defending its territory, but morale depended not only on numbers and weapons, but on belief in leadership. Soldiers who heard of political quarrels in the capital or who felt their pay was delayed began to question whether their loyalty was returned in kind. A disciplined army can hold walls against great odds, but an army uncertain of its leader's judgment is less likely to endure hardship with the same resolve. Religious life, too, reflected these tensions. Temples remained central to Babylonian identity, yet their leaders were not immune to political rivalry. Some priests aligned themselves closely with certain court factions, hoping to secure funding or influence. Others grew critical of royal policies, especially when religious festivals or offerings were neglected in favor of secular projects. This created subtle fractures in the spiritual unity that had once reinforced both the king and city. The gods still watched over Babylon, but the interpretation of their will became entangled with human ambition. To the ordinary citizen, life still went on. Markets opened, children learned trades, families celebrated marriages and mourned their dead. But beneath these routines lay a growing sense that the great machine of Babylon was no longer running as smoothly as it once had. Trust, the invisible glue of empire, had thinned.
people obeyed, but with less enthusiasm. They complied, but with less pride. When the moment of crisis arrived, this quiet erosion would matter more than the height of any wall. A kingdom that looks strong from a distance can already be weakening at its core, and Babylon, for all its grandeur, had begun to hollow out long before its enemies found a way inside.
The king who wasn't there. At the heart of Babylon's quiet weakening stood a strange absence, one that many citizens felt but few openly discussed. Their king, the figure meant to embody the city's power and divine favor, seemed distant not only in space but in presence. A great empire can survive harsh seasons, foreign threats, and internal disputes if its leadership remains visible, decisive, and trusted. Babylon, however, found itself guided by a ruler who was physically removed from the rhythms of the capital and emotionally detached from the expectations of those he governed. Nabonidus, the last king of Babylon, was not a warrior king like some of his predecessors, nor a builder of vast new monuments meant to unify the people in shared pride. Instead, he devoted much of his attention to religious matters that, while meaningful to him, did not resonate in the same way with the powerful priesthood of Marduk, Babylon's chief god. He spent extended periods away from the city, residing in distant oases and regions far from the center of political life. During these absences, he entrusted authority to his son, Belshazzar, who managed the day-to-day affairs of the kingdom. To many Babylonians, this arrangement felt unusual, even unsettling. Kingship in Babylon was not only administrative, it was sacred. The king played a central role in religious ceremonies that affirmed the bond between the gods and the city. His presence during festivals, especially those honoring Marduk, symbolized cosmic order. When Nabonidus failed to participate consistently in these rituals, priests and citizens alike began to question whether the traditional harmony between throne and temple had been disrupted. It was not merely a political issue, it was a spiritual one. A king absent from the city's sacred life seemed like a sign that something in the divine balance had shifted. Belshazzar, acting as regent, tried to maintain stability, but he lacked the full legitimacy of a crowned monarch. He presided over banquets, oversaw administration, and commanded forces, yet he did so in the shadow of a father whose priorities seemed increasingly removed from Babylon's immediate concerns. This dual structure of authority created uncertainty. Who truly spoke for the kingdom? Who carried the ultimate responsibility before the gods and the people? In times of prosperity, such questions might have been ignored. In times of looming danger, they became more pressing. Foreign observers noticed this fragmentation. Persian intelligence understood that divided leadership often meant slower decision-making and weaker coordination. While Babylon's court debated religious reforms and ceremonial roles, Persia focused on military logistics and strategic positioning. Cyrus did not need to defeat a united, decisive command structure. He needed only to face a leadership distracted by internal disagreements and uncertain legitimacy. The absence of the king also affected morale among the population. Stories spread of Nabonidus's long stays away from Babylon, and with each retelling, the sense of distance grew. A ruler who did not share in the city's daily life seemed less connected to its struggles and fears. When taxes rose or trade slowed, people wondered whether the king truly understood their situation. Loyalty to the throne weakened not through rebellion, but through quiet detachment. The bond between ruler and ruled, once reinforced by ritual and visibility, had thinned. On the night of the feast, when Belshazzar presided over the celebrations, the symbolism was stark. The acting ruler celebrated in a palace glowing with light, while the official king remained elsewhere, absent from the city whose fate was about to be decided. It was a moment that captured Babylon's political condition perfectly. Power displayed outwardly, but authority divided at its core. An empire led by a king who was not truly present was already adrift, and when the crisis came, that absence would weigh heavily on the city's ability to respond with unity and resolve.
Walls that touched the sky. To understand why Babylon believed itself safe, one must first look up, far up, toward the immense walls that defined the city's identity as much as its temples and palaces did. These were not simple fortifications of stone and timber, but colossal structures of baked brick and bitumen, layered and reinforced over generations. Travelers who approached Babylon for the first time often described the walls with a kind of disbelief, as though they had come upon a man-made mountain range rather than a city boundary. The outer defenses stretched for miles, wide enough in places for chariots to pass each other atop them, and high enough to make even the boldest attacker hesitate. Towers rose at intervals, providing vantage points over the plains, while massive gates, adorned with glazed tiles depicting lions, bulls, and dragons, served as both entrances and symbols of divine protection. The most famous of these, the Ishtar Gate, was not only an architectural marvel, but a statement. Babylon stood under the watch of powerful gods, and its walls were their earthly reflection. Generations of citizens had grown up under the shadow of these defenses, and with time, the walls became more than stone and brick. They became a psychological shield. Parents told children that no enemy could ever break through them. Merchants from distant lands spoke of Babylon as an impregnable fortress, a city whose strength lay not only in its wealth, but in its physical invulnerability. The very scale of the walls shaped the mindset of the population. Danger, when imagined, always seemed to belong outside, far beyond the reach of daily life. Even when news arrived of Persian advances and cities falling one by one, many in Babylon remained calm. They trusted in their defenses the way sailors trust a sturdy ship, rarely considering that even the strongest vessel can be undone by a flaw no one expected. The walls had repelled armies before. Assyrian threats, rebellions, and regional conflicts had all failed to bring Babylon down. History itself seemed to confirm the city's security. But walls, no matter how grand, are only as effective as the strategy behind them. Babylon's defenses were designed to withstand direct assault, siege towers, battering rams, and waves of infantry. They were built to keep enemies out through force. What they did not account for was a strategy that bypassed confrontation altogether. The very confidence inspired by the walls contributed to a dangerous complacency. Guards stood watch, but not with the tension of men expecting an immediate breach. Supplies were stockpiled, but the urgency of a prolonged siege was not deeply felt. After all, who would dare challenge such fortifications head-on? This mindset dulled the sense of vulnerability that might have driven stricter vigilance. The gates, though massive, depended on human discipline. The river that flowed through the city, a natural advantage in times of siege, also represented an opening that could not be sealed without disrupting life itself. Yet few believed these could ever be exploited. In the minds of Babylon's inhabitants, the walls were absolute. They did not imagine that their greatest protection could become a symbol of overconfidence. The sight of those towering ramparts reassured them night after night.
even as Persian engineers and commanders studied maps, measured distances, and searched for weaknesses not in the bricks, but in the assumptions behind them. In the end, the walls would stand largely intact, not shattered by siege engines or fire. Their failure would come not from physical destruction, but from a plan that rendered their strength irrelevant. Babylon had built walls that touched the sky, but it had forgotten that security depends not only on height and thickness, but on understanding how an enemy thinks.
The plan no one expected. By the time the Persian army reached the outskirts of Babylon, Cyrus the Great understood something many conquerors before him had learned too late. Some cities are not taken by force, but by patience and imagination. Babylon's towering walls and vast defenses made a direct assault impractical, if not impossible. Siege warfare against such a fortress could last months or even years, draining resources and morale on both sides. But Cyrus had no intention of testing the strength of Babylon's bricks and towers. Instead, he and his commanders began to study the city not as a wall to be broken, but as a system to be understood. At the heart of Babylon's design flowed the Euphrates River, dividing the city and sustaining its life. The river was both a blessing and a vulnerability, though few Babylonians saw it that way. It brought water for drinking, irrigation for crops, and trade routes that connected the city to distant lands. Its steady presence was so familiar that it faded into the background of daily life, as constant and unquestioned as the walls themselves. But to the Persians, the Euphrates was not just a river, it was an opening. Cyrus's engineers observed the terrain around Babylon, mapping the river's course and identifying places where its flow could be altered. They discovered that upstream, the land allowed for the construction of canals and reservoirs capable of diverting a significant portion of the river's water. This was no small undertaking. It required coordination, labor, and careful timing. Yet the Persians were motivated by a clear vision. If they could lower the water level within the city, they could create a passage where none had existed before. While Babylon prepared for a conventional siege that never came, Persian soldiers labored beyond the horizon, digging channels and preparing to redirect the river. The plan relied not only on engineering, but on psychology. Cyrus knew that Babylon's confidence was as formidable as its walls. He understood that the city's leaders believed no enemy would dare attempt a risky, unconventional maneuver. This assumption became the foundation of his strategy. Instead of confronting Babylon's strength, he would exploit its blind spots. The timing of the plan was equally crucial. Cyrus waited for a moment when the city's vigilance would be at its lowest. Babylon was a place of grand festivals and religious celebrations, nights when music filled the streets and attention turned inward rather than outward. Such occasions provided the perfect cover for an operation that required silence and precision. As the Persians completed their preparations, they did so with the knowledge that success depended on surprise. If Babylon discovered the plan too soon, the river's banks could be fortified and the opportunity would vanish. But the city remained unaware, its rulers focused on internal affairs, and its people confident in their supposed invulnerability. The genius of Cyrus's plan lay in its simplicity. He did not seek to batter down gates or scale walls under a hail of arrows. He aimed to walk into Babylon through a path created by its own lifeline. The Euphrates, once a symbol of the city's prosperity and resilience, would become the quiet road by which an empire ended. It was a strategy no one inside Babylon truly expected, because it challenged their fundamental belief that strength lay only in visible defenses. The Persians had recognized what the Babylonians had forgotten, that the most effective attacks are often those that turn a city's greatest advantages into its greatest weaknesses.
The river begins to fall. As night approached and the city prepared for celebration, something subtle yet historic began to happen beyond the sight of Babylon's watchtowers. Upstream, where Persian engineers had worked in silence and secrecy, the Euphrates was no longer following its ancient path alone. Channels carved into the earth now guided much of its water into vast basins prepared to receive it. Slowly at first, almost imperceptibly, the level of the river flowing through Babylon began to drop. No alarms rang, no messengers ran through the streets. The change was too gradual, too quiet, and far too unexpected to draw immediate concern. Inside the city, life followed its familiar rhythm. Markets closed for the evening, homes filled with lamplight, and music drifted from courtyards where families gathered to eat and drink. In the royal palace, preparations for a grand feast were underway, the halls bright with torches and polished gold. The ruling elite believed the city stood secure behind its colossal walls, protected by centuries of engineering and divine favor. Outside those walls, however, Cyrus's plan moved forward with precise timing. Persian commanders waited for confirmation that the river had lowered enough to make passage possible. Scouts observed the changing waterline, noting how the current slowed and the depth diminished along the riverbanks that ran beneath Babylon's defenses. Where once the Euphrates had been a deep and fast-moving barrier, it was becoming a shallow, manageable path. The river, which had long served as a natural moat within the city's walls, was quietly transforming into a road. The brilliance of the plan lay not only in its engineering, but in its invisibility. No smoke from siege engines marked the horizon, no battering rams thundered at the gates, no ladders rose against the walls. The Babylonians were waiting for a kind of war that was not coming. Their attention was fixed outward and upward on battlements and towers, while the real threat crept in low and silent. Even those who might have noticed the river's unusual behavior had little reason to suspect danger. Rivers rose and fell with the seasons, and minor fluctuations were not unheard of. To interpret the lowering water as a sign of invasion required imagination that complacency had dulled. Babylon's long history of dominance had conditioned its people to believe that enemies could be repelled by force, not by cleverness. By the time the Euphrates had dropped to a level that exposed stretches of the riverbed, the Persians were ready. Soldiers stood poised in the darkness beyond the city, awaiting the order to move. Their armor was muffled, their torches unlit, their advance designed to be as quiet as the flowing water they were about to follow. They were not charging into battle. They were stepping into history through an opening Babylon itself had never considered vulnerable. Within the city, laughter and music echoed through the night air, carrying across rooftops and courtyards. Few could imagine that beyond the walls an army was preparing to enter not by storming the gates, but by walking along the very channel that had sustained Babylon's greatness. The river that had given life to the city was now withdrawing just enough to let in its conquerors, and almost no one inside realized that the balance of power was already shifting beneath their feet. Soldiers in the riverbed. While Babylon celebrated under torchlight and music,
The first ranks of Persian soldiers stepped into the exposed riverbed of the Euphrates, their boots pressing into mud that only hours earlier had been hidden beneath flowing water. The descent was careful and controlled, officers whispering orders down the line as men adjusted their footing on the slick ground. The current, now weakened and shallow, tugged only gently at their legs as they moved forward in disciplined silence. Above them, the towering walls of Babylon loomed in darkness, their silhouettes broken only by distant guard fires whose keepers stared outward toward imagined threats in the open plains rather than down into the channel below. The brilliance of the maneuver lay in its quiet inevitability. There were no horns, no battle cries, no clashing metal. The Persians advanced like a shadow stretching through the heart of the city's defenses. Each step brought them closer to the inner gates that connected the river passages to Babylon's streets. These gates, built to control trade and water traffic, were not designed to withstand an army moving on foot through a drained channel. Some were poorly guarded, others left partially open to allow the normal flow of movement along the waterfront. The assumption had always been that the river itself was protection enough. Persian scouts moved ahead, locating entry points and signaling to the main force. Small groups peeled away to secure positions along the banks, ensuring that once the invasion began, confusion rather than resistance would define the city's response. The soldiers understood their orders clearly: move swiftly, avoid unnecessary noise, and seize control of key passages before alarm could spread. They were not here for a glorious siege, but for a swift occupation. Inside Babylon, the night deepened. Noble houses glowed with lamplight, and the sounds of feasting echoed through the palace district. King Belshazzar's banquet was reaching its height, wine flowing freely as guests toasted their city's supposed invincibility. Stories of Babylon's past triumphs filled the hall, each retelling reinforcing the belief that no enemy could ever breach its defenses. The irony was profound. While the city's elite celebrated safety, foreign soldiers were already inside its walls. As more Persian troops entered the riverbed route, their confidence grew. The Great Barrier of Water had become a corridor, and Babylon's legendary fortifications had been bypassed without a single stone displaced. What had once symbolized strength was now the very path of vulnerability. A few guards along the riverside began to notice unusual movement in the dim light, but hesitation slowed their reaction. Reports traveled slowly, passed from one uncertain watchman to another, and by the time word began to reach higher command, Persian units were already spreading through the lower quarters. Streets that should have been secure were filling with armed men who moved with purpose and discipline. The fall of Babylon was no longer a distant possibility discussed in whispers among enemies. It was unfolding in real time beneath the very feet of citizens who still believed themselves safe. The city that ruled the world for generations was being taken not with thunder, but with quiet footsteps along a river that had, until that night, always belonged to them. The gates left open. As Persian soldiers fanned out from the riverbanks into the dim streets of Babylon, the question that would echo through history began to answer itself in the quietest, most devastating way possible. The gates were open. Not all of them, not wide and welcoming as in times of peace, but enough and carelessly enough to turn the greatest fortified city in the world into a place suddenly vulnerable from within. These inner gates along the river passages had long been treated as routine points of movement rather than critical defensive positions. Merchants passed through them daily. Fishermen tied their boats nearby, and laborers moved along the waterfront at all hours. Over time, vigilance had softened into habit. Guards assigned to these posts thought more about boredom than danger. The walls might have been legendary, but familiarity had dulled the fear that once kept watchmen alert. That night, with festivities drawing attention toward the palace district, discipline slackened even further. Some guards had slipped away to join celebrations. Others lingered near braziers, talking quietly and glancing only occasionally toward the dark waterline. When the level of the river began to drop, a few noticed but assumed it was a seasonal change or an odd fluctuation, not the beginning of a calculated invasion. The idea that an enemy would dare attempt entry through the riverbed seemed absurd. Babylon had stood for centuries. Who would risk such a plan against walls that had never fallen to direct assault? Persian advance units encountered little resistance at these gateways. In several places, the wooden or bronze doors that should have been sealed at night were ajar, left that way for convenience or oversight. Where small groups of defenders did attempt to react, they were quickly overwhelmed by disciplined Persian troops moving with clear objectives. The invaders did not waste time fighting prolonged skirmishes. They pushed forward, securing intersections, barracks, and communication points, ensuring that even if the alarm spread, coordination among Babylon's defenders would collapse into confusion. Inside the city, rumors began to stir like a distant wind before a storm. A watchman running breathless through a side street, a servant whispering that strangers in foreign armor had been seen near the river, a merchant startled by the sight of armed men moving with purpose through a normally quiet quarter. But Babylon was vast, and disbelief spread as quickly as fear. Many assumed these were isolated incidents, misunderstandings in the dark. How could enemies be inside the city when the walls still stood and the gates facing the plains remained closed? The greatest strength of Babylon's defenses had become a psychological trap. People trusted the walls so completely that they dismissed evidence contradicting their safety. By the time word reached higher officials that Persian forces were moving within the lower districts, the situation had already slipped beyond control. Messengers sent to verify reports failed to return, either captured or lost in the growing confusion. Officers who tried to organize a response discovered that units were scattered, some unaware of any threat, others already cut off by advancing Persians. The city's defensive system had been designed to repel an external siege, not to respond to an enemy emerging from its own streets. Thus, the open gates were more than a physical oversight. They symbolized a deeper failure. Babylon had not fallen because its walls were weak, but because its certainty was absolute. Complacency had replaced caution, and routine had replaced readiness. In the silent hours before dawn, as Persian control expanded block by block, the truth became unavoidable. The city had been breached not by force alone, but by the slow erosion of vigilance that had begun long before that fateful night.
The city that slept through its own fall. While Persian soldiers moved steadily through Babylon's lower quarters, most of the city remained wrapped in a strange, almost peaceful stillness, as if history had chosen to whisper rather than shout. Lamps still burned in homes where families talked late into the night, unaware that foreign troops were already within the walls. Musicians in distant courtyards continued to play for lingering guests, their melodies drifting into streets where, only a few blocks away, disciplined ranks of Persian infantry advanced in silence. This contrast was the true nature of Babylon's fall, not a thunderclap of destruction, but a quiet turning of fate while life carried on as if nothing had changed. The city was so vast that events unfolding in one district could remain unknown in another for hours.
By the time isolated cries or hurried footsteps began to ripple outward from the riverfront, many dismissed them as drunken disturbances or routine patrol activity. Babylon had known unrest before, minor conflicts, arguments between rival factions, and the occasional outbreak of violence in crowded markets. The mind preferred familiar explanations over the unthinkable truth that the greatest city in the world was being taken from within. In wealthier districts, servants continued their duties, preparing late meals or tidying courtyards after celebrations. In poorer quarters, laborers who had worked all day lay sleeping deeply, too exhausted to notice the subtle shift in the city's pulse. Even some watchposts farther from the river reported nothing unusual because nothing had yet reached them. The Persians advanced with purpose, avoiding unnecessary noise, securing strategic points while leaving much of the population undisturbed. This was not chaos, it was calculated control. Near the palace complex, however, the first real tremors of panic began to surface. Messengers, pale and breathless, arrived with fragmented reports. Armed men seen near the river, guards missing from their stations, strange movements in districts that should have been quiet. Officials struggled to interpret the information. Some insisted it must be an internal uprising or a misunderstanding, because the alternative, that an enemy army had penetrated Babylon's defenses, seemed impossible. Orders were delayed by disbelief. Time, the most precious resource in moments of crisis, slipped away. Meanwhile, Persian units secured storehouses, armories, and key crossroads, ensuring that even if resistance formed, it would lack coordination and supplies. Their progress was methodical, almost administrative, as though they were taking possession of a city already surrendered by its own confusion. In some neighborhoods, residents finally encountered foreign soldiers face to face. A door opened to see armored figures standing calmly in the street. A late traveler turned a corner and froze at the sight of unfamiliar standards in the torchlight. Yet even then, reactions were muted. There was fear, yes, but also hesitation. These soldiers were not looting or setting fires, they moved with order and restraint. The absence of immediate brutality delayed the realization that Babylon had fallen in all but name. By dawn, the illusion shattered. As the first light revealed Persian banners in places where Babylonian insignia should have flown, the truth spread rapidly. The city that believed itself eternal had changed hands while most of its people slept. No great battle had shaken the walls, no roaring assault had announced the end. Instead, Babylon passed from one empire to another in the quiet hours of the night, undone not by destruction, but the slow, silent collapse of certainty that had begun long before the Persians ever touched the river.
The end of the king. By the time the truth reached the inner chambers of Babylon's rulers, the night of celebration had already curdled into a night of dread. What had begun as music, laughter, and the clatter of golden cups became whispers, then shouts, then the frantic rush of messengers stumbling over each other in narrow palace corridors. The king's feast, once a display of wealth and confidence, now seemed like a cruel joke played by fate. Servants who had been pouring wine moments earlier stood frozen, listening as officers demanded answers no one could give. How could an enemy be inside the city? How could the gates still stand while foreign soldiers walked the streets? The questions spiraled, feeding panic rather than clarity. The ruler himself, who had hours before been surrounded by praise and luxury, now faced the first real test of his power, and found that power slipping like sand through open fingers. Reports arrived in fragments, guards missing from key posts, strange movements near the river, confusion among commanders who had never prepared for a defense inside the walls. Some advisors urged immediate flight, others called for a last stand within the palace complex, but there was no time to build a unified plan. Babylon's leadership, long accustomed to ceremony and control, was paralyzed by disbelief. The idea that the city had already been compromised felt unreal, as if they were trapped in a nightmare from which they expected to wake. Outside the palace, Persian forces tightened their hold on the surrounding districts, cutting off routes of escape and communication. Their advance was so organized that it felt less like an invasion and more like a transfer of authority already decided by history. Within the palace halls, armed retainers assembled, but even they sensed the imbalance. They had trained to defend walls, gates, and towers, not to fight in corridors while the city beyond them slipped away. Torches flickered against polished stone as hurried councils dissolved into arguments. Every option seemed worse than the last. To fight was to risk slaughter. To flee was to abandon the symbol of Babylon's power. To surrender was unthinkable, yet increasingly inevitable. The king's final hours of authority were marked not by bold decisions, but by shrinking possibilities. Messengers sent to rally distant units never returned. Loyal officers who went to assess the situation vanished into the spreading web of Persian control. The palace, once the beating heart of an empire, began to feel like an island cut off by a rising tide. Some within its walls wept quietly, not only for their own fate, but for the end of a world they had believed permanent. In the end, the fall of Babylon's ruler mirrored the fall of the city itself, not in a single dramatic moment, but in a steady erosion of certainty, support, and hope. By the time Persian forces reached the palace district in strength, resistance was fragmented and symbolic at best. The king who had feasted under bright lights now faced the darkness of irrelevance. His authority, built on the illusion of invincibility, had dissolved before the first sword reached his door. Babylon had not only lost its walls and streets, it had lost the center that held it together. And with that loss, the empire's final illusion shattered into silence.
A conquest without a massacre. When the Persians finally stood as masters of Babylon, something unexpected happened. The city did not burn. No great slaughter stained its avenues, no towering columns of smoke rose to mark its humiliation. Instead, life seemed to pause, take a breath, and then cautiously continue. For a city that had expected either victory or annihilation, this quiet transition was almost more shocking than violence would have been. Markets reopened within days, temples resumed rituals, and the rhythms of daily life slowly reassembled under new authority. The conqueror, Cyrus, understood something many rulers before him had not. A city as rich and complex as Babylon was worth more intact than in ruins. He entered not as a destroyer, but as a restorer of order,
presenting himself as a liberator rather than an invader. This was not simple kindness, it was strategy of the highest level. By respecting local customs, honoring Babylon's gods, and allowing its priests and elites to keep their positions, Cyrus turned potential rebellion into cautious cooperation. The people, already weary of their previous rulers, found little reason to resist a king who promised stability and continuity. Inscriptions would later portray him as chosen by the city's own chief god, a brilliant piece of political theater that blended conquest with divine approval. For ordinary citizens, the change in rulers felt less like a violent break and more like a shift in atmosphere. Taxes still had to be paid, fields still had to be worked, families still had to be fed. The banners above the gates had changed, but the walls still stood, the canals still flowed, and the great temples still towered over the skyline. The lack of destruction created a strange illusion that nothing fundamental had changed, even though the center of power had moved hundreds of miles east. This peaceful takeover also revealed just how hollow Babylon's resistance had become. A city that truly believed in its rulers might have fought to the last street. A population united in purpose might have turned every house into a fortress. But Babylon offered only scattered resistance, quickly swallowed by the new order. Cyrus did not need to break the city's spirit. It had already been weakened by years of internal division, political instability, and loss of trust. By the time Persian authority settled over Babylon, many inhabitants saw more to gain from acceptance than from defiance. The conqueror's restraint also carried a powerful message across the ancient world. It signaled that Persia's empire would not be built solely through terror, but through incorporation. Cities could keep their identities, their religions, and their traditions as long as they recognized Persian supremacy. This approach allowed Cyrus to rule vast territories with fewer revolts and less need for constant military suppression. Babylon became not a ruined trophy, but a functioning jewel within a larger imperial crown. Yet this mercy also underlined a painful truth for the Babylonians themselves. Their city had been taken so smoothly that the moment of loss almost slipped past unnoticed. No dramatic last stand to remember, no heroic final battle to enshrine in legend. Instead, Babylon drifted from independence into subordination with barely a ripple, and that quietness made the fall feel even more profound. An empire that had once shaken the world had been absorbed without flames, without screams, without a final roar, only the soft closing of a door that would never open again.
Why the people didn't fight. When the news spread that foreign soldiers had entered Babylon, many expected chaos, barricades, and desperate resistance. Yet the streets remained strangely calm, as if the city itself had grown too tired to defend its own freedom. This quiet acceptance did not come from cowardice, but from years of slow erosion that had drained the will to fight long before the Persians appeared at the gates. The people of Babylon had lived through shifting rulers, religious tensions, heavy taxation, and political decisions made far above their daily struggles. Loyalty to the throne had weakened as confidence in leadership faded, and when trust disappears, the desire to sacrifice for a government vanishes with it. Farmers along the canals worried more about the next harvest than about royal pride. Merchants cared more about stable trade than about which banner flew above the palace, and priests feared disorder more than they feared a new king. For many, Persian rule did not look like the end of the world, but like the beginning of a different arrangement, one that might even bring relief from existing burdens. Babylon had become a city of individuals rather than a united body, and without unity, resistance becomes nearly impossible. The ruling class had also failed to build a sense of shared destiny. The grand monuments and massive walls stood as symbols of past greatness, but they did not create loyalty in hearts that felt ignored or exploited. While the elite enjoyed privilege within palace walls, ordinary citizens carried the weight of taxes and labor. When danger came, those who felt excluded from power saw little reason to defend it. Some may even have hoped that new rulers would break the grip of entrenched interests and open space for change. In such a climate, the call to defend the city rang hollow, echoing off stone, but not stirring blood. Fear played its part as well, but it was a quiet, calculating fear. The Persians had a reputation for strength and organization, and stories of their victories had traveled ahead of them. Fighting might mean destruction of homes, loss of livelihoods, and chaos that would hurt the vulnerable most. Surrender, by contrast, offered the possibility of continuity. Families could remain together, shops could reopen again, fields could be sown again. For a population that had seen enough uncertainty, survival often mattered more than pride. There was also the subtle influence of religious interpretation. When leaders fall out of favor with the gods in the eyes of the people, conquest can be seen as divine judgment rather than mere military defeat. Some Babylonians may have believed that the change in power was part of a larger cosmic order, that the city's fate had been decided long before the Persians diverted the river. In that worldview, resistance would not only be futile but impious. The city's own history offered little comfort. Babylon had conquered others in the past, and its people knew what it meant to stand on the losing side of history. Empires rise and fall, and those living through the transition often choose adaptation over annihilation. By the time Persian soldiers walked through the streets, the psychological battle had already been decided. Babylon did not explode in rebellion because the energy that fuels resistance had been quietly consumed by years of internal weakness, divided loyalties, and the simple human desire to endure.
The empire that collapsed without a battle. The fall of Babylon remains one of history's most unsettling lessons, because it did not come with the thunder of siege towers, the crash of shattered gates, or the desperate screams of defenders fighting to the last breath. Instead, one of the greatest cities on earth changed hands with a silence that felt almost unreal, as though the empire had already ended in spirit before the Persians ever set foot inside its walls. Empires are often imagined to die in fire and steel, but Babylon shows another path to collapse, one far slower and far more dangerous, where decay spreads invisibly
until the final moment requires barely a push. For generations, Babylon had stood as a symbol of wealth, culture, and power. Yet beneath the shining temples and wide processional roads lay fractures that widened year by year. Political instability weakened the structure of authority, religious tensions eroded unity, and economic strain quietly drained confidence in the future. By the time Cyrus approached, Babylon was not a fortress brimming with resolve, but a giant weighed down by its own exhaustion. The Persian conquest revealed that an empire can fall long before the gates are breached. The physical defenses of Babylon were legendary, but walls cannot protect a city whose people no longer believe in the leadership behind them. An empire survives on shared purpose as much as on armies, and that sense of purpose had thinned like worn cloth. Officials argued, priests divided over policy, and the ruling court struggled to inspire loyalty. When the Persians advanced, they did not face a united civilization prepared to resist. They faced a society uncertain of itself, a population calculating its chances rather than rallying in defiance. This is why the conquest seemed almost effortless. There were soldiers, yes, but no widespread uprising, no coordinated defense, no heroic last stand that later generations could celebrate. Instead, Babylon slipped from one empire to another, like a torch passed without ceremony. The absence of battle does not mean the absence of tragedy. A city losing its independence without resistance reveals a deeper kind of defeat, one rooted in the slow erosion of identity and trust. Babylon's fall reminds us that strength is not only measured in stone and bronze, but in cohesion and belief. When those invisible bonds weaken, even the grandest capitals become fragile. Cyrus understood this reality and used it to his advantage. He did not need to destroy Babylon because it was already hollow in the places that matter most for survival. By presenting himself as a restorer rather than a destroyer, he stepped into a vacuum of legitimacy that Babylon's own rulers had created. The empire did not shatter, it simply dissolved into a new order. This quiet transfer of power is what makes Babylon's story so haunting. There was no dramatic end to mark the close of an era, only a realization that the age of Babylon had already faded before anyone truly noticed. The city remained, the temples still stood, and life continued, but the empire that once commanded fear and admiration across the ancient world had vanished without a defining battle, leaving behind a warning that greatness can end not with a roar, but with a whisper. What Babylon had already lost. Long before Persian soldiers stepped through the riverbed and into the sleeping streets, Babylon had already begun to lose the very things that once made it unshakable. And this invisible loss mattered far more than any army waiting beyond the horizon. At its height, Babylon was not only powerful because of its walls or wealth, but because it believed in itself, because its people felt connected to a shared destiny shaped by their gods, their kings, and their traditions. Yet over time, that confidence thinned, stretched, and finally frayed. The empire had expanded and ruled vast territories, but expansion brings complexity, and complexity brings strain.
Local loyalties replaced imperial unity, provincial elites grew distant from the center, and the idea of Babylon as the unquestioned heart of the world no longer rang as true as it once had. Economic pressures also began to weigh heavily on daily life. Grand construction projects and court luxuries demanded resources, while trade routes shifted and rival powers rose, forcing Babylon to spend more just to maintain the illusion of dominance. For ordinary people, this meant heavier burdens and fewer rewards, and when daily life becomes harder while rulers appear detached, loyalty quietly erodes. The spiritual fabric of the empire weakened as well. Religion in Babylon had always been deeply tied to political legitimacy, with kings presenting themselves as chosen or protected by the gods. But disputes over rituals and priestly authority created tension within the very institutions meant to unify the population. When faith in divine favor weakens, faith in rulers often follows. The court itself contributed to the decline. Instead of strong, present leadership capable of inspiring confidence, Babylon endured periods of uncertainty, shifting authority, and decisions that seemed more concerned with palace intrigue than the well-being of the wider empire. People do not rebel only when they are starving or oppressed. They also drift away when they feel unseen, unheard, and unrepresented. By the time Persia rose as a serious threat, many in Babylon did not view the coming conflict as a fight for survival, but as yet another change in the long story of rulers and empires. The emotional bond between people and state had weakened so much that resistance no longer felt urgent. This quiet detachment is one of the most dangerous conditions an empire can face, because it removes the will to defend what still physically exists. Babylon's walls still stood tall, its temples still gleamed, and its markets still bustled, but the inner strength that once animated those structures had faded. What Babylon had already lost was cohesion, confidence, and a sense of collective purpose. When Cyrus approached, he did not confront the Babylon of legends, fierce and unified, but a civilization tired of its own rulers and uncertain about its future. In that condition, conquest becomes less about force and more about transition. The fall of Babylon teaches that the true collapse of an empire begins long before enemies arrive, in the slow, almost unnoticed erosion of trust between a people and the system that governs them. And by the time the gates open, whether by mistake or choice, the empire has already fallen in spirit, leaving only the final quiet change of banners to mark the end.
The illusion of invincibility. Babylon's greatest strength had always been its image, and in the end, that image became its greatest weakness, because an empire that believes it cannot fall stops preparing for the moment when it inevitably will. For generations, the city had stood as a symbol of human achievement so vast and so dazzling that people across the ancient world spoke of it with awe, describing walls that seemed to touch the sky, temples that shimmered with color and gold, and gardens that defied nature itself. This reputation was not entirely false. Babylon truly was magnificent, but over time, admiration turned into overconfidence, and overconfidence dulled the instincts that once kept the city alert. Leaders trusted in fortifications more than in vigilance, in legacy more than in adaptability, and in the memory of past victories more than in the realities of present threats. The people, hearing constantly of their city's greatness, came to accept security as a permanent condition rather than a fragile one. When danger is distant for too long, it begins to feel impossible, like a story from another age rather than a risk that could arrive tomorrow. This mindset shaped decisions both large and small. Military readiness became routine instead of urgent. Warnings were weighed against pride, and inconvenient possibilities were easier to dismiss than to confront. Even as Persia grew stronger, Babylon's confidence acted like a veil, softening the perception of risk. It was easier to believe that the great walls would always be enough than to imagine that an enemy might find a way around them. History shows again and again that powerful societies often fall not when they are weakest, but when they are most certain of their strength, because certainty breeds complacency, and complacency creates openings. In Babylon, this illusion of invincibility seeped into daily life. Merchants traded, priests performed rituals, nobles hosted feasts, and officials managed affairs with the steady rhythm of a city that had known stability for generations. The extraordinary became ordinary, and the idea that anything could truly threaten Babylon felt almost absurd. Yet beyond the walls, the world was changing, alliances shifting, and new powers learning from the strengths and weaknesses of older empires. Cyrus and the Persians did not need to defeat Babylon's confidence, they simply needed to let it continue unchecked. The more secure Babylon felt, the less it questioned its own vulnerabilities. This psychological armor, once protective, became rigid and brittle. When the Persians devised their plan to use the river as a pathway, they were exploiting not only a physical feature, but a mental one, the assumption that Babylon's defenses were absolute. No empire can remain unchallenged forever, but those who believe they can often fail to notice the moment when reality has already begun to contradict the myth. Babylon's illusion of invincibility made the city slow to react, slow to imagine the unimaginable, and slow to recognize that the world outside its walls no longer revolved around it. By the time the truth became undeniable, events were already in motion, and the confidence that had once united the people now left them unprepared for a change that felt sudden but had been building for years. The fall of Babylon was not only a military or political event, it was the shattering of a belief, the realization that no matter how grand a civilization appears, it is still bound by the same laws of time, change, and human error as every empire before it.
The lesson of Babylon. When we look back at the fall of Babylon, it is tempting to see a single dramatic moment, a night when a river lowered and foreign soldiers slipped through shadows, a story that feels sudden and almost unreal. Yet the deeper truth is slower and quieter, unfolding over years in decisions that seemed harmless at the time. Empires rarely collapse because of one event alone. They weaken through habits, assumptions, and patterns that go unnoticed until they can no longer be ignored. Babylon teaches us that decline often begins in comfort, when success becomes routine and vigilance feels unnecessary, when leaders rely on inherited strength rather than renewing it, and when a society mistakes stability for permanence. The Persians did not defeat a city at the height of its power. They entered a city that had already begun to drift away from the qualities that once made it strong. Internal divisions, political uncertainty, economic strain, and fading trust in leadership created a landscape where resistance felt less urgent and unity less certain. By the time the external threat arrived, the internal foundations were no longer solid. This is why the conquest seemed almost effortless, why a city famous for its defenses could change hands with so little open conflict. Babylon had already lost something essential before a single Persian soldier set foot inside its walls. The story also reveals the limits of physical defenses. Walls, gates, and fortifications can slow an enemy, but they cannot replace adaptability, wise governance, and the loyalty of a population that believes in its leaders. When these deeper elements erode, even the strongest structures become symbols rather than safeguards. The illusion that Babylon was untouchable prevented the city from seeing that the world around it was shifting, that new powers were rising with different strategies and new forms of organization. Cyrus did not rely solely on force. He relied on understanding the weaknesses of those he opposed and presenting himself as an alternative rather than only an enemy. In doing so, he entered history not only as a conqueror, but as a ruler who absorbed rather than destroyed, turning Babylon into part of a larger empire rather than reducing it to ruins. This approach succeeded because Babylon's people were already uncertain about their own future. In the end, the fall of Babylon reminds us that the greatest threats to a civilization often come from within, from complacency, division, and the gradual loss of purpose. External enemies can exploit these conditions, but they rarely create them alone. The city that once stood at the center of the ancient world did not vanish in a blaze of destruction. It changed hands almost quietly, its power fading, not with a roar, but with a long exhale. That quietness is part of the lesson. History does not always announce turning points with noise and spectacle. Sometimes it moves in subtle shifts that only seem obvious in hindsight. Babylon's story endures because it reflects a pattern seen again and again. Greatness achieved, confidence built, vigilance relaxed, and opportunity seized by those who are still alert. The true fall of Babylon, then, was not just the moment Persian banners appeared in its streets, but the years when the city slowly forgot what had once made it resilient.